So we're going to start out with John Shook, who is the president of the American Institute of Philosophy and Political Thought, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here, and then when he's done, I'll introduce the speaker. I am Randy Osher, okay, and I own this house, but not really the institution. The institution, we hope, is something that will go far beyond the house into a series of activities that John's going to tell you about. We're happy to be your hosts for now and for the foreseeable future. John Shook.
Well, thank you for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see you all here. We're going to get to Pete real quick. I'm going to be very quick. Our institute here is about providing a space that the humanities always seems to need. Of course, academia and universities and so forth have been, on and off, a very good home for the humanities in general, cultural thought, cultural expression, but sometimes we have to go off campus in order to do the important work of life. The important work of life is why we established this place. Yes, there's a little bit of regret that universities aren't able to be as generous towards the humanities or to American philosophy in particular as we might like, but as they say, we don't deal the cards, we just have to play them. And so what we decided to do was marshal the resources necessary to make philosophical thought in America vibrant and practical. For that, you actually need space. Surprisingly enough, and although we're devotees of the internet and all things electronic, that is not enough. You actually need to bring people together with common problems, and they may find common solutions. This is the pragmatist speaking in me, but I'm also idealistic, and this is the concrete representation of an ideal, namely that humanities and philosophy in particular can make a real difference going forward to the democratic life and cultural thought of not just this country, but of course we're networked around the world thanks to good friends in the Deweyan world. Larry Hickman is with us. Larry Hickman, of course, from the Center for Dewey Studies, now emeritus, showing the way how American philosophy can not just be of a curiosity in foreign countries, but actually a living, vital, intellectual force, of course, translated where it makes sense around the world. So we're proud to be networked with that sort of effort. Another example is the way that we're networked with philosophers doing real work on interdisciplinary problems focused on things like how can philosophers do public philosophy. Randy and I just came from a conference that we helped to inspire and lead at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. And there we met with 30 to 40 folks, I kind of lost track, who are all searching for the same thing, namely how can their philosophical expertise be networked in with a way to not just educate the public, but to make the public more powerful. We're talking about empowering, which is essential to democracy. So we kind of feel like we're doing our little bit of part for advancing the future of democratic participation. That's about the spiel. Go to americanphilosophy.net if you want to learn more about our activities and hopes and plans for the future. But welcome to this space. It's a marvelous space. Be sure to ask Randy for the official tour or the unofficial tour after the event, and we're very proud of this space. And as you can see, we're filling it with books, but the most important thing is we're filling it with life and thought. With that, let's bring up some life and thought. You ready? All right. We're going to have an introduction from Randy Osher next. And thank you very much.
We've spent the last several days cataloging books. One of the things that occurred as we attempted to turn this thing into the thing that it is that a very nice 15,000 book collection became a 35,000 book collection. And that is a lot of books. And if I never see another book again, for 25 minutes. Anyway, so I'm really glad that you guys are here. I'm really happy to have Larry Hickman and John Shook, co-directors and co-founders of the AIPCT here. But I'm also really pleased that this year we are hosting a Kahn lecture. Louis Edwin Kahn was born in 1908 and he died in 2004. I was fortunate enough to know him in the last 20 or so years that he was on the planet. He was a person who, to me, was the ultimate gentleman of philosophy and a person who ushered in East-West dialogue, but also ushered in so many generations of younger academics, aspiring academics, and people who just cared about thinking and talking together. Louis Kahn was a model that all of us should aspire to emulate and to continue the legacy of people like him. One of the things that Louis Kahn did was he was the secretary and treasurer of the Foundation for Philosophy of Creativity from its founding. It was about 1957, somewhere in there. From its founding until he passed that on to me in 2001. And the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity was put together. It was the vision of William Sherman Minor, who was, he had a full career. He was one of those professors who was recruited by Delight Morris to come to SIU. Back in the day when they would force retire people at 65, this is before the Gray Rights Revolution. One of the things that Delight Morris was so good at was taking advantage of this forced retirement policy that so many places had. And he brought William Minor here from the University of West Virginia. At about 1967, I think, is when Bill Minor came. And he was a stalwart of the Communication Studies Department at SIU, specialist in the philosophy of communication, and he had founded the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity and its associated societies for the philosophy of creativity. Louis Kahn was his longtime supporter in this endeavor. It has met with success in the sense that the Foundation and its associated societies have put on important programming at the American Philosophical Association. They have had, for example, in 2002, here we had a huge conference at SIU called the Frontiers of Creativity. And it's interdisciplinary, and it's a matter of bringing together people who think about what makes creativity possible for the human beings. Bill Minor was a leader in that, and Louis Kahn was somebody who saw that Bill Minor's vision needed support, and he stepped in and he worked with him. Among the many, many other things Louis Kahn did in his life then was to lend his support and his energies to the Foundation for Philosophy of Creativity. I bring that up because, in fact, the primary association between Louis Kahn and tonight's speaker was that they worked together in the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity for all of those years. And I hope that the sort of activism that our speaker for this evening embodies, that sort of activism is the sort of spirit that will take hold in all humanistic endeavors. You have to get out there and not just think about creativity, you got to create things. And so the person that is speaking to you tonight is the person who, in my opinion, has done more than any other single person I have ever met to bring to fruition an actual project that's both creative and philosophical, and yet it changes people's lives and it changes the world. Pete is going to be humble about what has been accomplished because he'll talk about how so many other people were instrumental in the creation of the Big Thicket. But for environmentalists, one of the things you have to realize is that you have to learn how to be where you are. The environment as an abstract concept is a very, very little value. The environment. Live. That's everything. So, Pete lives in Texas. And in Texas, they didn't used to have a giant national biological preserve called Big Thicket, but now they do. In fact, the world had never heard the idea of a national biological preserve. Pete was one of the people who created that idea, and then brought it to fruition. Now, obviously, many hundreds of people worked on it. It's his baby. So, Pete Gunter is Professor Emeritus, Regents Professor Emeritus at the University of North Texas in philosophy. But, I mean, at the University of North Texas, he started the very first environmental philosophy program. And you can get a PhD there. Along with Max Olschlager, they conceived of an academic program. But if you really want to see his life's work, you go hiking down in the Big Thicket. So, Big Gunter, come tell us about it.
We're going to have an introduction. That's the kind of introduction to have. My ego has now been shored up to the point that I'm sure I can deliver this talk. A copy of this talk is on the table back there. If anybody wants a copy of it, you can get it. And equally, there a copy of a brochure which disappeared. Wait a minute, I'll get one of them here.
I'll pass them out.
Which is a map of the Big Thicket National Preserve and an account of what it is, and it's very pretty. And, well, let's just get started. This is both a philosophical and environmental talk. It seems to me that the two fit together rather well. If you're going to be an environmentalist, you should know what you're trying to do. You should have some ideas beyond, say, the immediate project or projects that you have. You would want to know how all those projects fit together and why you're doing it. There's some people who like to act but don't think. There are too many people who like to think but don't act. And so I try to put this thing together. The first, wait a minute, this is not my article. I'm working on another article and somehow got it confused with the talk I'm going to give you tonight. I'm sure that you will be delighted to learn about the fractal nature of geometry as Bergson understood it. But if you're not up on fractal geometry, I don't think it would probably have much impact. Here we go. All my life, all my adult life, I've been trying to save something. The really sad thing is that I don't know what it is. That is, along with many others, I've been trying to save a sub-region of East Texas called the Big Thicket. But I don't know what it is. If it were a swamp like the Everglades or a mountain chain like the Smokies, it would be no problem. You could go to a topo map, look up the boundaries, and there it is. But what about an extraordinarily diverse plant growth region? What is a plant growth community after all, or more inclusively, what is an ecosystem? Are they simply aggregates of individual plants or trees? Or are they, as some have argued, organisms? Such questions, I insist, are not the mere quibbling of those most obscure generalists, the philosophers. They cut to the heart of biology and what is meant by some central biological terms. And as different as philosophy and science are, I can find no absolute boundary between them. Philosophical ideas seep into the sciences, scientific ideas creep into philosophy. And the following essay, as you will see, pursues this foggy boundary to the bitter end. So, here's the second part, the Big Thicket, the first look. Well, what is the Big Thicket? Some have called it Lapland, where Louisiana laps over into southeast Texas. It is the part of Texas that looks entirely unlike what the state is supposed to look like. Technically, it is the southwesternmost extension of the southern evergreen forest. It is deep south. If you think of Texas as somehow as a gigantic desert, then this swampy, seepy William Faulknerian world is not what you think of as being part of Texas, but it is. It is, in some parts of this extension are open, sand hills, pine savannas and prairies, but most, as the name suggests, are dense and impassable. Swamps, seeps, bagalls, palmetto jungles. Besides the biological definition of the region, there are folklore definitions. These often disagree with each other. Unsurprisingly, they also may disagree with biological definitions. If folklore on the thicket is diffuse, scientific writings are sometimes hard to deal with. That is, alternative scientific definitions of the area are proposed along with alternative folklore definitions. Attempts to define the region exhibit both strong scientific difficulties and a dramatic conflict between mythos and bios. These divergencies, I can tell you, made conservation there extremely difficult. Because if you say, well, we want to save the Big Thicket, and one company say, well, where is it? Well, we didn't have a map. I mean, we knew where the folklore definitions were, but they disagreed. And beyond that, there are all kinds of questions. We don't know who first called the area the Big Thicket, nor are we sure how the vague persistent presence of the thicket came very early to be lodged in the collective consciousness of Texas and adjacent states. It was simply there, a remote place where, in the words of the folklorist J. Frank Dobie, men went to forget and be forgotten. The 1936 Big Thicket Biological Survey states, just who made first reference to it is unknown. The Spanish padres, in visiting the missions in the Nacogdoches country, record that between the missions and the sea there existed a forest so thick that it was impossible to traverse it, and that Indians in traveling there from the missions, to the Spanish missions, to the sea went by canoe because there weren't any trails. Early settlers arriving in Texas from the states to the east skirted the Big Thicket on the north and the south, leaving the densely vegetated area mostly to its own devices. And so a dark mythology grew up about a place entirely world-lost, forsaken, and threatening. Historical events reinforced this image, because just to the east on the Louisiana side of the Sabine River lay something called the neutral ground. Now this is early 19th century. A mini-county area belonging neither to Spain nor to the United States, a no man's land occupied by drifters, fortune seekers, escaped criminals, highwaymen, feral vice presidents, escaped slaves, and Indians. When the neutral, and that's frightening to think of a feral vice president. And we only have 27 at the university I work at. When the neutral ground was annexed in 1821 by the United States, many of its inhabitants spilled over into the Big Thicket region in southeast Texas. Thus, if the land started with a reputation for natural wildness, a reputation for violent and untrustworthy people soon was added to it. The Big Thicket now had bad blood. So you have this very powerful myth about the Big Thicket. What is it? Where is it? Not easy. Now I'm going to skip to a philosophical point, or maybe a scientific point. I'm going to make some more remarks on a science called Mereology. That's Mereology. Mereology is the discipline which deals with the relations between parts and wholes and between the parts within wholes. Bet you never heard of it. It must make explicit what is meant by whole, W-H-O-L-E, and whether parts can be wholes on their own. It must also address the problem of definition. One must, if there are wholes, be able to state their essential characteristics. This essay is not so much an exercise in mereology as it is a set of reflections on it. The whole/part relations to be considered will be matters of biology, or more narrowly of forest ecology. And the question to figure out here is whether anything as sprawling and diverse as a forest can be considered a whole, or more particularly an organism. And so I think it can, but it won't be easy. As it happens, in biology there is no universally accepted definition of life or living things. There is a common sense working definition, however. A living thing must be able to, 1, reproduce, and 2, contain a complex integrated metabolism. But this definition consists of 2 definitions, not 1. It's double-barreled, and it shouldn't be. It ought to be single, but it's not. And also, the second component, the metabolism, might be stated differently, probably to include structure. Well, that's an interesting puzzle. It's one I didn't fully realize existed. Now, the term life is taken as an example of what we call intention. The intention of a term is its definition or meaning. Extension, by contrast, refers to the individual entities covered by the intention. Particular instances of the term rectangular, for example, might include tables, envelopes, and calling cards. And then we could define rectangle, that would be the intention. And the problem is that in the case of life, we have a term which by extension covers all and only organisms. Anything not an organism cannot be termed a living thing. Anything not living cannot be termed an organism. But if we can't define life in any simple and satisfactory way, then how can we single out the entities called organisms? If we can't define life, to take the matter just a step further, how can we define organism if what we mean by living things in particular is organism? This is the fundamental issue in this essay as far as biology is concerned. One might solve the problem by claiming that life, or by extension organism, is simply a living cell or a multicellular entity. And you know, when you and I went to high school, that would have done. It would have been quite satisfactory. However, to take just one example, there's a recent discovery of viruses carrying genetic elements, viruses which are more complex than living cells. It can be argued then that such viruses are living things even if they cannot reproduce out of a host organism. If so, one cannot define organisms simply by pointing to a cell, because here are these new gigantic viruses, and what are they? The people that discover them argue, passionately that these are organisms. And the people who don't like viruses argue just as passionately. It's quite a violent and despicable, and fruitful debate that's going on among these scientists. All right, now the 4th section, forests as wholes. Here are these examples that really blow my mind. And if you know about them, it will still have to strike you as strange. Catch this. In Utah, there is a grove of quaking aspen whose roots literally grow together to make one root. The root of one tree grows into the root of another tree. Okay? The roots of one tree grow into the roots of the next, and that into the next, and so on ad infinitum. Then if one aspen sends out a message to its roots asking for water or nutrients, other trees will send the raw materials back to their roots in reply. When the generous trees themselves signal for help, the favor is returned. Water or nutrients are shifted to the tree or trees in need. This Utah forest covers 108 acres. It is also claimed to be 80,000 years old and to weigh 6,000 metric tons. The genes in each tree are identical. Is it therefore a 108-acre organism? A lot of biologists agree. Okay, then let's move on to the next thing. Most tree species do not grow their roots one into the other. Okay? They don't need to, and that's the really striking discovery, and it is also recent. This stuff is recently in the public mind and not that old in biology. A lot of discoveries going on. The really striking recent discovery is that mycelial fungi do the job for them. These fungi interconnect adjacent tree root systems, growing into the tips of one set of tree roots and then into the tips of other nearby tree roots, linking not just one tree, but many. These fungi also explore the forest horizontally and vertically, and effectively they have a root network of their own, so they enlarge the root network of the forest. If the roots of the forest trees are part of the fungal network that literally connects one root system to another through a conduit through which water and nutrients can be transported, then can we say that, as claimed in the case of the quaking aspen forest, we're dealing here with a single forest organism. But this might be a forest that has several different species of tree. But if the fungi connect them at the roots, so that the forest is a set of interconnections between trees exchanging information and exchanging nutrients and exchanging water, then where does one tree stop and the next tree start? And wouldn't it make sense to consider the forest a whole, W-H-O-L-E? This was new to me. So I hope you find it is interesting. Finally, in India, there is a banyan tree, which, I'm sorry for the accent, I can't help it when I talk about India. I studied at Cambridge University and I kept running into these old India hands who had been there to India, and it was glorious. And here I am back in England. A banyan tree which sprouts some 400 taproots, each of which grows into a tree. The tree, famous in India as a fountain, as a terminus of pilgrimage, covers 5 acres. Just one tree, 5 acres. Can we deny that it is an organism? And I'm going to toss out to you just 6 more examples, just so that you'll know that this is a very widespread thing in nature. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a fungus covers Armillaris bulbosa, covers 30 acres and has been called the world's largest organism, I suppose, in terms of weight. In Switzerland, a honey fungus covers nearly 120 acres and is approximately 1,000 years old. And here's 3 other examples. Massive fungal mats in Oregon, a system of ancient creosote bushes, and Posidania oceanica, a colonial marine plant in the Mediterranean Sea. And I have no doubt that innumerable such other plant growth communities or single organisms will be found as people come to realize that such things actually exist. I cannot then, well, so what? Well, lumber companies think of forests as so many distinct trees that can be cut. And that's what you do with trees, you cut them. And then you don't worry about the root networks and the fungus, and you sell them, and you make money, and finally your mother loves you, and and you've done what Jesus told you to do.
Careful.
The first realization that mycelial webs, which can link root systems, occurred, states Susan Simar, who's a biologist out there in the Pacific Northwest, happened in the Pacific Northwest around 1998 in order to explain the remarkable fertility of the forest there. Shortly after, something else was discovered. They had been getting rid of a tree called a paper birch, as a trash tree, for a long time. And one day, some scientists, finally doing some research, discovered that when you got rid of the paper birches, there was a general decline in the health and productivity of the Douglas fir. And the Douglas fir is the big economic tree in the Pacific Northwest. Thus, far from being the useless and eliminable species people believed, the river birches turned out to be busy, quotes, feeding the soil and helping their coniferous nothing else. But it may well turn out that those pine forests do better if they have some other species with them, and that's the research which needs to be done. I think you'll probably find that either superstory trees or understory trees probably might do better in the pine forest, and they'd be healthier and more resistant to disease if you had some other species in there. Well, if you get several species in a forest, then you can start having trunks, each a tree. 2, a forest probably generated originally from a single tree, with each new tree clearly a distinct organism, but systematically connected at their roots. 3, forests whose roots are conjoined by mycorrhizal fungi, a fungal pipeline which creates unity of information, water, and nutrients among supposedly distinct trees of different species. These examples ground a classical slippery slope argument. The banyan tree is clearly one organism. It is a tree, and any tree is, by general agreement, an organism. But next, we have an aspen forest, also generated originally one tree, all of whose outposts are strongly connected to the original. It is not difficult to describe this forest as an organism, but it may stretch our notion of an organism. But if this is an organism, then how can we fail to treat forest trees decisively linked by mycorrhizal fungi, which exchange information, water, and nutrients in exactly the same way as organisms? If we accept the first, the banyan tree, and then we accept the second, and then we're going to crash to death at the notion of making a forest into an organism. But if we accept the third, then perhaps we should extend the notion of organism to include plant growth communities, ecosystems, or even more. But this is quite a jump, conceptually. But root talk is not the only social way in which forests sustain themselves. The example which follows is about the same as the ones noted above, the profound sociability of the forest. But they operate on a different level, at the level of insects. Insects are more into the wood of trees, and they also eat the leaves of the trees. The trees have developed a defense against such depredation. What is surprising is to the extent to which these defenses are shared between trees, extended so that the chemical defenses emitted by one tree reach the next tree, which takes that as a signal, and it emits its own chemicals, which reach another tree, which emit chemicals, and so on ad infinitum. The whole forest erects a defense. It has contrasting ways of doing this. A tree may emit chemicals which attract an insect, which predates on whatever insect is attacking that tree, or the chemicals emitted by the tree may simply drive off the pest. Either way, the defenses mounted by one or a few trees become active in the whole forest community. This is rather astonishing, because it is as if the forest had developed its own immune system. I don't think forests have an immune system, any more than I thought they had this elaborate communicative network in the roots. It changes my picture of the forest. Now, the next section, 5, is called Some Philosophical Reflections. It's a bit lengthy and a bit involved. I think maybe I'll try to shorten it and put it this way. Western philosophy, when it comes to wholes and parts and atoms and things, has a prejudice. That is, that in order for a thing to be a thing, it has to be simply located, preferably unchanging, and unaffected by anything around it, or not seriously affected. So what we have is the concept of atomism, and you find it in the Democritus and Epicurus among the Greeks, and Lucretius and Epicurus among the Romans, and in the Newtonian idea of a mass particle, an atom. But when you turn around to the metaphysicians, as profoundly as Spinoza disagrees with all of those that I just mentioned, he still thinks the universe is one great big atom. He doesn't call it that. But the same thing is true of 20th century metaphysicians like F.H. Bradley. And I think, in my interpretation of Hegel, it's also true of Hegel. That if you don't like building up the world from little bitty atoms, that are changeless and externally related, then get one great big atom that is changeless, and you can have the two views. The Hegelians and the atomists hate each other. They don't realize they have the same logic. A thing must be simply located, must be particular, must be unchanging, must be unrelated to all the stuff around it. And of course, if I'm very critical of this point of view, it's because I think if you want to take a forest to be an organism or a something, then you've got to give up either the prejudice for big atoms or the prejudice for little atoms. And that allows intercommunication, and it allows internal relations, and it allows things that depend upon other things to be what they are. But that is the way I think the world is. You and I depend upon our genes, what we ate growing up, who our parents were, who our brother was, who our father was, or mother, or aunt, or uncle, or grandfather, and what social class we were in, and all this is part of what comes to us. We aren't little atoms. We are, I think, real individuals, but not independently of the world that environs us and allows us to be individuals. And this is the Whiteheadian doctrine of the social individual, essentially. But I think it's true of ecology, and I think it's true of psychopathology, and I think it's true of pretty well all the way down. So now I'm going to make another distinction. It's a pity to have to make so many. I introduce a distinction derived from the thought of Alfred North Whitehead between colonial organisms and monarchical organisms. A colonial organism has no central command post. Its behavior, if we can call it that, is broadly distributed and consists largely in growth, like a tree. That would be a colonial organism for Whitehead. A monarchical organism, by contrast, can, consistently with its central nervous system, centrally control its behavior. Birds, mammals, reptiles, animals generally. Perhaps the reader guesses where this is leading. The notion of a colonial animal approximates that of a plant growth community. It contains, as scientists are beginning to see more clearly, persistent coordination between the species which make it up. Yet we can find no centralized behavior in such an entity. Mobility in space for a forest is largely a matter of seed dispersal or growth at the apical meristem, at the tips of the limbs. Animals move around, by contrast, and direct their behavior as a whole. On the other hand, it is a bit strange to lump such a plant growth community together with trees as organisms. A tree has far more singular location than a plant growth community. It has greater genetic unity and a far more single pattern of existence than a tree is here. We want anything that's real to be here, as if we could grasp it. I propose to resolve this problem that we distinguish two sorts of colonial organisms. One, like trees and shrubs, which I will term simple locus colonial organisms. I'll repeat that, simple locus. And the other, which consists of plant growth communities, ecosystems, which I will term multiple locus colonial organisms. For the great majority of biologists, this would be to extend the concept of organism probably beyond anything they would want to do. Whitehead incidentally wanted to extend the notion of organism to include molecules, atoms, and subatomic entities. I don't know if I want to do that or not. The fundamental image behind the idea of multiple loci organisms is for me that of a tissue. The sort of tissue which best illustrates such is the epithelial tissue, or the skin. The notion of tissue was introduced into physiology by the French scientist Bichat in 1801. It is interesting that the word tissue in French is also intimately connected to the notion of cloth and weaving. Thus, a cloth with open weave in French is a tissu lâche, while a closely woven cloth is called a tissu serré. The word tissue, and the French for weaving, is, of course, tissage. It is interesting that, as in the forest systems, Cells and tissues contain junctions which make communication possible between adjacent cells. So a single locus colonial organism has a unified location with a tight organized structure like a tree, while a multiple loci colonial organism has a plural location with a more diffuse and less architectural structure. Like epithelial tissues or loosely woven cloth, it sprawls by its very nature. Rather than being centered in one place, it reaches out to cover many places. Its existence will also be a matter of a longer time period required to pass information or raw materials from one locus to another. Well, it's helpful in this context to consider an ordinary organism, a lichen. These, and you've all seen lichens, the little patches you find on rocks and on stumps and on trees. They're usually gray, but some are grayish green, and then there's various tropical lichens have all sorts of colors. They consist of two organisms, a fungus and a chlorophyll-bearing plant. The fungus shelters the plant, and the plant supplies the fungus with nutrients. And this is, of course, an example of symbiosis or mutualism. By contrast, the mutualism of the young moth, yucca moth, and the yucca plant, a well-known example of being symbiotic, without not which neither survives, is intermittent. But the mutualism of lichen, however, involves a lifelong, very close physical relationship between fungus and algae. Hence the biologists term lichens organism. But if we can call a lichen an organism, then it is all the more plausible to extend the term to include similar plant communities. An analogous loosely woven fabric that we find in lichens, we now discover exists in forests. The reader will perhaps begin to suspect that this article presents a broader preoccupation. The ultimate question approached here is more broad. What sorts of things can we call real, or what do we mean by something? I believe, as the examples of Spinoza, Newton, and Leibniz show, that we approach this question with a prejudice. We want real things to be perfectly one, to be simply located. We want things to be such that, at least in principle, we could grasp and manipulate them. But the cell and the tree only exist in the context to which they are significantly interrelated. And to conceive of them with no intrinsic relations to their environments is to fail to see them for what they are. That is, relational existences. It is also to fail to see, to take the account and explore, take into account and explore the number of important facts which help explain them. It is, in my opinion, to violate Peirce's maxim, which is never to block research. What I'm talking about in its broadest reaches is metaphysical, but its particular applications is scientific. And so I find myself unexpectedly able to appreciate more fully William James's extended criticism of F.H. Bradley's idealist monism. Why, James repeatedly objected, in order to think correctly about the world, do I have to end in a unitary, unchanging, closed, absolute mind? The consecutive relations between things, the way that they hang together without attaining perfection, surely provide a sufficiently realistic approach to the real. James, in formulating his pluralism, held that there are many degrees of unity in the world that both science and common sense reveal to us. I think he would have liked the idea of a multiple locus organism. Now I skip back to the Big Thicket. Okay. We didn't know how to save it, and we didn't know what structure it should have, and we needed to save all of the plant growth communities in the Big Thicket, which, depending on which biologist you talk to, are either 12 or 14. You get the longleaf pine savanna, you get the shortleaf pine savanna, you get the bagall, which is a unique kind of swamp, you get the cypress swamp, you get the Tupelo swamp, you get the cypress Tupelo swamp, you get the sphagnum bog, you get the 2 or 3 different kinds of prairies, depending on whether they're Gulf coastal prairies or prairies coming from further inland, or one other called the, we don't know really where it came from, it's called Pigeon Rouge Prairie. And when the carrier pigeon that we used to have in this country would nest there, that was caused by birds, we think. The scientists don't agree on that, they have different opinions. So you got all this diversity. And you want to keep it all. You want all of the 35 species of ferns, all of the 35 or more species of orchids, all of the 285 year-round species of birds, and the more 200 more species of birds that come there only in the winter. And you want to have all of the vines, and you want to have, well, we didn't know what to do. We were innocent, we were ignorant, and we made lots of mistakes. And if I were going to give advice to anybody who wants to do something for the environment, it is this. Strange advice. Don't be afraid to be a fool. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Because I will guarantee you that you will. And I hate to list the ones I've made and the stuff that people I insulted when I should have had my head. Yeah. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. And then I discovered in my old age, I never knew this until a couple of years ago, I'm related to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, General Beauregard of Louisiana, and George Patton. Now I understand the second piece of advice, and that is never call retreat. Persist. It took us 10 years to create that National Biological Preserve in 1974. And in that period, it looked hopeless. People called us fools, and all the other stuff you could imagine. The chairman of our Board of Regents was from East Texas, and he never stopped threatening me over what the lumber companies thought of it. Well, just never call a retreat, because you're going to have some defeats. And so you're going to have to persist. Now these 2 definitions, don't be afraid to make a mistake and never call a retreat, they're more gutsy than intellectual, aren't they? But I never was one who could believe that anything significant that happened in this world happened because of pure ideas. You go behind the ideas, you find human motivations. Those motivations concern what? The freedom and well-being and dignity and cussedness of human beings. So that's the second. And the third is educate yourself. I was ignorant of more than I could imagine when we started. But by now I can give you the binomial nomenclature of numerous dozens of species, and I can identify the different plant growth communities. I can talk about the different soil structures, and you get to know things when you work with them, and so you'll get to know things when you work with the environment. Let me. I'm getting off the topic of this paper in a way, but the word ecology and the word economics come from the same root, oikos. It's the Greek word for house. If you're in Athens, as I was years ago with a friend of mine, and you're sitting there in their living room, the phone rings, they answer, and oike means I'm at home, I'm in the house. Well, economics is the study of the house, and ecology is the running of the house. Ecology is the study of the house, economics is the running of the house. If you start out with this 19th century distinction between the transcendental beauty of nature and the ugliness of factories, then, well, there's some kind of truth to that, but how do you deal with that when you want to set aside 100,000 acres and it has some economic value to X or Y? How do you talk about saving the environment from global warming if all you can tell people is shut down all the industries? And it's not going to happen. And we have to be able to bring ecology and economics as close together as we reasonably can. So let me say, well, I don't think that can be done. Well, let me give you one example. It's quite recent. North of Austin, Texas, is a little place called, let's say, 20,000 people, Georgetown. Nice little town. They have decided that they're going to get rid of fossil fuels, and they're only going to have wind energy and electrical energy and biomass energy and various other renewable resource energies. And if you ask them why, they'll say, we're not a bunch of damn fern fanatics and tree huggers, and we're not gay either. We want to cut our energy bills. So they're doing it. There's a little town in Oklahoma that was hit by a tornado and was wrecked. I think its name is Wagner.
Wagner.
Is it
I was there, it was Wagner.
Wagner? Hot damn. Okay, it's Wagner. Well, you know, they're doing the same thing. They're going to rebuild the town, but they're going to make it solar and wind energy and so forth. Up on a place that used to belong to one of my great-great-uncle's ranches in Texas. They have set aside about 600 acres. It's a wind farm. That money gets taken to the county seat, Gainesville, and then it gets shipped down to Denton, and we can buy that energy in Denton. I would have said that's impossible if you see, but it's there as of the last 12 years. All these things are happening because people can cut their expenses. Do you think that our president and his great wisdom about the environment could stop that? No. That's going to be a folk movement. And people decide, look, if I can pay only 1/3 less for my energy bills, that's a great deal of money. Look what I can do with that. So it's going to be a folk movement, and the politicians won't be able to stop it. Because if some little town decides to do it, they can do it. But in our little town of Denton, Texas, the city-county landfill has been covered over with clay, and the light hydrocarbons, particularly methane, that come out of that is being harvested and sold. See, well, but I mean, this is a practical and economic way to make money. And similarly, in a town that had no recycling when I came there, and in which the heads of the university looked on me like Willie Lovelow, if you remember Red Stilton, you know, like an idiot because I said you should recycle. But they're all gone now. But now the university does massive recycling, and the city does massive recycling, and they take the stuff, and they take the limbs and branches that I cut down off dead trees in my yard, and they put them through a chipper shredder, and then they sell it so people can use it on their gardens. And then they take the other yard waste and mulch it and make potting soil and sell that. That is, we have not started to scratch all of the economic possibilities of the environment and ways that people can make a living. And again, what is recycling? Every couple of weeks I take a mass of boxes to Goodwill Industry full of stuff. Well, it doesn't go into the city-county landfill, and people can continue to use it, and it makes jobs for people, because they will hire people who otherwise wouldn't get hired. It recycles any number of stuff that shouldn't be in the landfill, and so that's another way of doing something environmental, but it makes money for some people, and that's the kind of thing. It is not romantic. I mean, you know, it's not standing on the Rocky Mountain National Park and seeing the brilliant light on the mountains and the incredible ambiance that can't be equaled anywhere else. I agree that that's there. It's not romantic. It is practical, but in a sense it's romantic because it tells you you can save the world's environment, or at least make a damn good shot at it by recognizing that there are economic roots, and ecology and economics do not have to fight each other. And you know, that's the third point. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. And you know, second, never call a retreat. And third, get practical. And there's an endless number of things that you can do because of new batteries that we now have, and now computerized wind farms and ways of shipping electricity that are more efficient, and on and on and on and on and on. And on. Well, let me end with a couple more pages, I guess. This article begins with the question of what one has saved when one has saved a forest or other plant growth community. The bulk of the article is focused on showing that one has protected something that is far more interrelated and interdependent than we have generally believed. In communicating and sustaining each other, the forest species act as if they had signed some kind of Lockean social contract, willing to give up some of their own substance for others, on the assumption that the others will do the same when the time comes. Root talk demonstrates this communal character dramatically, but it only adds to what we already know about the many internally supportive relationships which help secure the forest's continued existence. Without the forest, its understory would vanish. Without the soil which the forest produces, the next stage in ecological succession could not occur. When I enter a forest, I have a strong sense of the forest as such. I'm confronted, then enveloped by something which presents itself as real, even substantial. This sense of the wholeness refuses to leave. Indeed, the more I explore the woods, the more time I spend there, the more pronounced is the sense of the forest as such. I cannot put my finger on precisely what this as such is. It could therefore be objected that I cannot produce an example of this as such, and so I must be chasing a metaphysical will o' the wisp. But I am not looking for a metaphysical it. Rather, I'm looking at a vast interconnected life possessing enough unity and vitality to be termed an entity without being what we have traditionally called an atom. So I'm going to talk about the moods and the personality of the forest. And one virtue of looking at it this way is that it brings our intuitive sense of the world closer to our scientific knowledge of it. Sensibility and scientific insight on this view approximate each other. What the biologist can now tell me about the forest makes all the more plausible my feeling of the forest as a persisting presence, not even conceivable as a mere aggregate. The poet's or the philosopher's efforts to capture the forest's wholeness is not merely subjective. I once heard Robert Frost reply to a reporter who said that poetry is only so much emotion, that poetry, in fact, gets life by the throat. And I agree with it. On the view presented in this lecture, the poet is literally in the man-nature interaction. The more seriously he attempts to participate in the given, the more real and the more effective is the result. So that if the reader and this writer were kayaking in the Big Thicket Preserve, say down the winding world-lost shadows of Pine Island Bayou, our sense of being cut off from the patchwork of suburbs and cut-over pine lands on the outside, and existing within a sprawling, seemingly endless living reality, a different reality but still real, this would not be some merely emotional experience, some kind of hot flash. It would be a real encounter of one sort of creature with yet another with slower, more decentered, different kind of life, but still alive. Its slow, primitive rhythms would penetrate us as we participate in them, in the complaint of a great blue heron breaking with the dark water or the constant drumbeat of the insects. Professor Oxher has challenged me to prove in this essay that a forest is a person. I can't do that, but I think it is possible to show that a forest has states similar to moods, and that it confronts us with what the French call présence, and what I might call, for lack of a better term, personality. In making this claim, I will struggle to escape anthropomorphism. The forest is not a great big human being, but life is in some respects, its life is in some respects similar to our own. A mood is a sustained emotional state. In people, there are widely diverse moods of depression, of expectation or contentment. Would it be stretching things too far to suggest that a forest in the spring embodies a quickening of tempos, a future-oriented, renewed vitality, analogous to our own rebirths of lived pleasure and lived intensity? If so, the human rebound from winter's suspended animation and the forest recovery from winter stasis would be taken as objectively similar. The sustained constant vitality of a forest in summer could be taken as embodying a kind of contentment. The reader will doubtless notice the shift here from relatedness to an emphasis on temporality, and this shift is intended. Communication between the root networks is timed to take advantage of the needs and capacities of trees. But growth, development, and decay and procreation in the forest are rhythmic and essentially so. In editorial recently in Science magazine, Denise Dubutte insists animal development is nothing but time. From the cell cycle to the beating of the heart, our own lives are composed of a multitude of microscopic and molecular oscillations. The study of causal relationships implies the examination of two time points, inducing the cause and looking at the effect. We are generally ignorant of the temporal rules governing this transformation. But as for personality, it's easy to turn to the examples of the Big Thicket Preserve, which was created so as to conserve all the forest types of East Texas. One can easily trek there from a cypress swamp to a longleaf pine savanna, from a savanna to a pine magnolia forest, and in so, assuming that one had a feeling, not only for its visual appearance, but for its massive, persistent rhythms, one will find three diverse vital signatures or personalities. A prolonged and thoughtful acquaintance with them will lead to acquaintance with their fundamental life. A visual forest is frozen music, but a live forest is a unique music all to itself, and we participate in it. So I think I've talked a long time. Let me conclude. You know that I started this talk, and I said that I'm very sad because I've spent my whole life trying to say something, and I don't know what it is. Okay? So, to conclude, the sadness mentioned at the beginning of this article has now vanished, for it is clear that those of us who struggle to save the Big Thicket had indeed saved something real. We saved a life. Okay, there it is.
I think there might be questions. Because I think that Pete is probably generous enough.
And they're so strung out across the land, and if you have these nature preserves on them, that you stand a good chance of saving the basic ecology and the basic species.
That's the idea.
Where are the pine thickets? Are they within these shaded areas, or are they outside?
You're talking about the pine plantations that the lumber companies do?
No, some of the other areas you referred to, the other ecosystems. So are they all inclusive? Are all those systems?
Well, there's a little thing, a sort of orphan unit, as we call it, the loblolly unit. The loblolly is a pine tree.
Yeah.
So we say, then there's another unit, the Hickory Creek Savanna, which has parts of a longleaf pine.
So you're saving like small fragments of these.
Well, sometimes it's small in the case of the Hickory Creek Savanna, but we're making up by by planting in the upper part of the Turkey Creek unit a whole longleaf pine savanna covering
Let me
a
interrupt
lot of
you.
acres.
Because your knowledge of this is so specific that it's not going to answer Ryan's question. And here's the thing. You're looking at a map out there. For him, this is like details. I can't believe how big this is. You guys are looking at corridors. It's huge. It's not patches, right? It's not
Well,
patches.
But in
Is
the
it
case of
sustainable?
the Hickory Creek unit, which if you looked over the map is small, in In the upper part of that, we have a longleaf pine savanna, but it's not big enough.
You'll
So
call
we
it
moved
a
over to
unit,
the-
you'll call it a unit that you couldn't hike around in 3 days.
Well, that's true, yeah. And of course, it's so dense, the vegetation, that it's very, unless they cut a trail through it, it's very hard to get through it.
I see. Is it, so as a whole, is this sustainable or is it gonna evolve into something else eventually? Or, you know how like,
Okay, usually, when you've got a forest type, it will move till it gets to the climax stage,
right,
and then it stops.
okay.
It doesn't change that ever, unless you burn the thing or
Right.
something like that.
And I'm under the impression that these are not climax stages.
Well, the longleaf pine savanna is a climax stage, and the loblolly pines are now up to 100 feet. That's about as big as they ever get, so that's in a kind of climax stage. In the Lance Rosier unit, we've got the stuff that's been growing for over 100 years, and it's reached a climax stage. And the others are reaching towards it. So you will then have
These things are the
these
size
different
of
units
Delaware.
aren't going to change. They'll reach an optimum point, and then they'll stop. And there's enough room there
Yes.
to where, for example, there's like a 1,000-acre shortleaf pine savanna in the Lance Rosier unit. Well, 1,000 acres is a pretty good
Yeah.
stretch of forest.
So, like prairies, for instance, are they sustainable? Will they always remain as a prairie?
Well, some will and some won't. And we have one thing that's private called the Mereology Prairie. It's about 17 acres. And it's a particular kind of coastal prairie with something called mima mounds, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
But we have to keep hacking away to keep the vegetation from coming in and covering the prairie.
Okay, so there is some maintenance to that.
Yeah, the best way to do this is with what they call a cold fire. That they start a fire and it burns out all this vegetation, and then you're able to keep the prairie contact.
Okay.
But you have to work to keep prairies, and you also have to work to keep orchid bogs and insectivore bogs. You have to keep burning them to keep things from growing in on them. But most of this place is big enough to sustain a good-sized forest of a particular type. When these forests reach their climax stage, then they remain at that stage.
Were there, before you guys did all this, there must have been some natural maintenance type, like fire. There might have been some natural fires or something. Or how did it stay maintained for the human and
Well, most of these forest types, even when it's terribly dry, they don't start a fire. The place where you would get fires and always get them was on the coastal prairie. And when the lumber companies came and started doing fire suppression, then the forest started marching out into the coastal prairie. And so you've got forest with, say, Batson is now, the Batson Prairie used to be 10,000 acres of prairie, now it's all forest because of fire suppression. But the preserve, we get 40 to 50 inches of rain a year down there. It's not a problem usually of getting moisture. So this thing we've made, and which you have on the map, is sustainable.
Okay.
I mean, it's a good question.
So natural fires are suppressed now, and then you have to have man-made fires to replace.
That moves slowly and gets rid of vegetation that you don't want. And then you have a big forest fire, but we don't have them.
Yeah. Right, they probably discourage that. Of course.
Well, but I mean, it's so wet. And I've been working on the Big Thicket project since I was 28 years old, and I'm 80 years old, and there hasn't been a fire.
Okay.
It's too wet.
Next.
Yeah.
How does a philosopher talk to this strange thing that is the government of Texas in order to make something like that happen?
I asked him this on the radio this afternoon. How do you actually get this to happen, given where you live?
Well, you better not be, number one, you better not act pretentious. But then my people came to Texas in around 1850, and they were well known and very busy doing stuff. So it helps me that I can say, well, people here have been along here as long as yours have. And then I'm an insider and not this guy from New York who, as we all know, is evil and has weird thoughts. He's shaking thoughts of crab and lobster in his head, and we don't like that kind of people. So,
I've never heard it called a crustacean.
well, but those Yankees are, well, I don't believe any of that, but that's a lot of people.
You have to be a political creature of your own place, I guess, is part of it.
It looks like one is very enlightened and the other is not particularly enlightened.
Well, before Texas flipped over into absolute conservatism, there were enough moderate liberals around that you could talk to them.
The answer is you got there first.
We got there first.
70s.
We got there first in the 60s and 70s, and so Price Daniel, who was one of our governors, he was from the Big Thicket area. So we could work with him, and then I'm trying to think of some, Dolph Briscoe, some of the others, we could work with them, and at least they wouldn't attack us. And then we could work with Senator Ralph Yarborough and some of the other Democrats that then were senators in Texas and managed to work the thing through.
But you worked with George H.W. Bush.
Well, you mean the father?
Yes.
Yeah, well, he was a pretty good conservationist. And in fact, when you look at the map of the Big Thicket Preserve that he proposed, it was the best map ever presented. There were Republicans with, but I mean, you had to be straightforward and honest and work and very personal, I think. You'd be amazed, for instance, John Tower was a very conservative senator from Texas, but he helped us. I've never been able to figure that out. But you talk to him and you're decent to him and straightforward, and you can accomplish a lot more than you think you can. Right now, the political system having changed, we raise money and we buy small pieces of land and give it to the Park Service. Well, we've been able to add 5,000 acres of land by doing it that way. So be flexible. That is, if any of you, I have a thing here, any of you who would like to donate to the Big Thicket Natural Heritage Trust, I've got a flyer and you could do so, and we'll take $5 or $5,000 or a dime. But every nickel of it goes to buying land. We don't have a well-paid executive director. We're not a fancy, there's just about a dozen of us who work very hard, but all the money goes right to the land. So there's, you just don't stop. And your enemies, it irritates them more than you can ever believe when you have been slaughtered and defeated and you just march up. You know, it's like the Russian armies. The Germans thought they'd killed all the Russians. No, not quite. Just keep on. Yeah.
Go ahead. Get back to the metaphysics. What do you think about the Earth as a terrestrial organism?
This is the Gaia hypothesis. Is the Earth an organism?
And even beyond solar system, perhaps.
Well,
Beckner goes there, and Gustav Beckner and William James has some positive things to say about him while putting out Bradley.
well, I haven't made up my mind about that. In many ways, the Earth is like an organism. And so we can't just consider it as a lump of clay with a bunch of things stuck on it. It is strongly interrelated through climate and through forests and oceans and glaciers and God knows what. And it works in certain ways to protect itself, as plants will do and organisms will do. So I would say that it's like an organism, but I'm not sure that I can go all the way and call it an organism, because I don't know what degree of interrelationship and complexity I need to say organism. I find it very hard to know. Incidentally, if you want a metaphysician, see, this is taken as a scientific concept, or at least a scientific thesis that the Earth is an organism. And the grandfather of all that was a guy named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if you ever heard of Chardin, but Earth is a single thing. And he did this long before a lot of scientists were doing it or other people were doing it. So here's a metaphysician who did something applicable. And I love to point that out, because we've had a philosophy since the 1930s, according to which anything that is metaphysical is anti-scientific and just a waste of words. That's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to Randy's challenge of Big Thicket as a person.
Say that again.
As Randy's challenge, he said something about he challenged you to say something about the Big Thicket as person.
Well, he said, can you, using your Bergsonism, can you define the Big Thicket as a person?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is not quite.
Okay, so let me just ask a little more about that. So we have corporations who are defined as persons.
We have what?
Corporations who are defined as persons in the United States.
But
But hold on. And in New Zealand, the Umano River has been given those same rights of a person, and that's how they are protecting that river. And in the Bolivian Constitution, built into that Constitution are the rights of nature, and they have been given the same rights as humans in their Constitution. So I'm wondering about that tactic of affording environments such as the Big Thicket, those
let me
kinds
ask a
of
corny
rights.
question. Would you like to make it so the coyotes could vote? We have,
You know, the rights.
Old-fashioned liberalism.
Yeah, I know.
Rears
Come on,
its
that's
head.
sort of a cop-out.
that's not a cop-out.
Yeah, that
No,
is.
it's
Well, when you
It's
say
totally
that
is.
nature has rights,
Think about the rights, think about the people in New Zealand who really made that claim. I mean, that's a really interesting claim
well,
as a way of preserving that river. They're indigenous
well,
folks
it might
who-
be, in a pragmatic sense, a very useful thing to do, but you're not going to tell me that the river is a human being or a person.
But if we've expanded the notion of rights to include corporations, or we expanded the notions of rights the way we're going, I mean, I'm not necessarily actually
Well, that's
for
it.
this.
No, I like that claim very much. If you're going to call a corporation a human being, a person,
Yes.
then
right.
why not a mountain?
Exactly.
Now,
That's
if you call a corporation a
that's
person,
exactly the question.
okay, my
And
answer is,
is it useful? Is it useful to go in that direction? If we're going to move in that direction,
Can't
to
we
use
do
that
a lot of
same
these-
tactic to
Well, okay.
preserve these
Here's two
spaces
answers.
that you're talking about.
first thing, I do not think a corporation really is a person,
Nor do
and I think that's a piece of very bad legal reasoning.
Yes.
So that's the second thing. And then the first thing. And then the second thing is, I don't know, protecting things on the basis of something that I know isn't true. Faith is believing what you know ain't so, said Mark Twain.
Person and human being are two different ideas.
Yeah,
Can I follow up? Well, so Les has had his hand up.
Okay.
You've had yours. Wade, Thurman.
Okay.
Let's move to Les.
Well, I don't
where
want
this
to,
goes.
I don't want to get buried in this question too much, but I like Royce's idea of interpersonality. That
Interpersonal.
interpersonality with Royce, and how communities can be people. And I guess, so as a segue from the last question into my question was, what do you think about a coexistence with nature, maybe as a future of giving these communities of biological communities rights because of the interaction that, obviously we privilege ourselves as humans. So what about interacting with people who are like-minded for the conservation of an area, having some kind of coexistential community having the rights of protection?
well, this gets to be so messy. When you start doing rights, then the whole discussion moves into law and politics. Well, I don't know that that's utterly escapable, but I would prefer that they be based on value and concern rather than law and rights that are claimed. And I think that the value and the concern might do us more good in the long run than haggling over rights. Now, I could be wrong, but I hate to just drag rights and everything suddenly becomes political, because I think we need to think biologically and ecologically, not legally, if we can. So, and under some circumstances, to give nature rights might be the only way that you could do it in practice. I would prefer to do it some other way. Love and concern, you know, Albert Schweitzer's view of nature, I think might be better in the long run and perhaps cause less political infighting. I'm not unduly dogmatic about that, but that's the fundamental feeling that I have. Yeah.
As a conservationist, have you found another fuzzy boundary between what's natural and unnatural? As far as having you mentioned it, this 19th century romantic view of untouched, pristine, virgin wilderness, but really there's no non-anthropogenic ecosystem on the planet. Humans are everywhere.
My Native American ancestors changed some things in American nature. Not nearly as radically as we have, the Europeans. But I don't know. I don't know that we need to use the natural, not natural language. I think the language of sustainability is much better because it says I want to keep the forest breathing in the air and cleaning it and being there so that we can enjoy them and being there so that we can raise trees and cut them and all of that rather than talking about anything else than that. So I don't know if that's it's a blunt answer, I guess, but it's an answer.
Well, I guess, so maybe a follow-up to that would be then, do you run into issues with the notions of sustainability and that? Because change is an essential and probably a healthy part of an ecosystem as well. Where do you draw the lines? What's sustained versus static?
Well, you know, I used the case of ecological succession. There's a Lance Rosier unit, which is the largest unit in the preserve, and it had been cut quite a bit. And the climax forest there is a mixture of lollolly pine, swamp chestnut oak, and southern magnolia. And I've noticed in the last 20 years as I've gone into that unit year after year that the magnolias are beginning to come back. And so we will have then those three trees making a climax community. It's fascinating to fly over in a helicopter and see this forest just covered with magnolia blossom. Mile after mile is what it used to be.
By the way, you guys almost can't imagine these magnolias. You're thinking about magnolia trees that grow here. This is not what he's talking about. I have one in my front yard that you would call impressive because you come from Southern Illinois. These magnolia trees are quite beyond what you're imagining. They're 4 times the height of the tallest ones that you would find in Southern Illinois. And they're so complicated compared to what you get in this stunted environment.
Oh, yeah.
In southeast Texas, you almost can't imagine what a magnolia is. You're thinking of a pretty little tree with nice blooms once in a while, because that's what it is up here. But that's not what it is in the Big Thicket. It's a gigantic tree that dominates environments.
How tall do they get in that environment?
120 feet.
Yeah, that would be about the time.
Yeah, 120 feet.
How big around are they?
Oh, huge. Yeah, that's
Like that.
Yeah. They get to be about 50 or 60 feet here at their height in southeast Texas. It's 3 times that.
Well,
Yes, Thurman. One last question, we should call it to an end.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to actually piggyback on the question earlier about whether forest ecosystem is a person. It strikes me that the value or the purpose of your paper is to raise our sense of value and concern for this forest ecosystem by thinking of it as an organism, by thinking of it as a multiple locus organism. And my point is, why not just go a step further? If it's really what we're trying to do here is try to think about this forest ecosystem in a way that raises our value and concern, why don't we just take it the next step and call it a person? Since we don't want to be limited by the actual empirical factors of whether it's a person or not, but what our concern, our sense of concern should be.
hot chocolate.
Yeah.
You notice how much scientific
I know, yeah, very
And the
much.
reason
He's trying to not
that
be
you take-
discredited.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The reason that I can look at a forest
Yeah.
as an organism is because of all the root network and the antibodies and the immune system in this way that I discovered that the
Yeah.
forest really doesn't work by individual trees. It works by interaction everywhere. It's very wide-heading.
Yeah.
And so when I want to say that it's an organism, I want to say it scientifically, but I want to remove some metaphysical prejudices about what an organism is.
Yeah.
If this then leads us to think of organism as the forest as having more value and helps us to save it, good, but the scientific stuff has to be there. So I can't just extend things indefinitely.
But yeah, and I struggle with that question too, but in the same sense, it's almost like, to me, it's like a means end thing where the end goal is that we really want to love this thing and not to protect it. How restricted should we feel by these questions about, like, you know, really treating it like one would treat a person, you know, as opposed to, well, we're going to treat it as far as the science allows me to treat it, you know, up to a point, or concern for this thing.
You realize this guy was successful in Texas, right?
Yeah.
You get that he was successful in Texas.
Yeah,
You do understand why your argument's not going to fly in Texas.
sure. I struggle with that question myself.
Yeah, but
Like
I don't
how-
want to, it may not look like it, but I'm perfectly glad to use any ideas that's a good idea and a well-founded
Yeah.
idea to help environmentalism.
Right.
But I'm not just going to extend things indefinitely. I want to know, does the forest have high ideals?
Well, in a sense, when we call each other persons.
I want to know if the forest sins. I want to know if the forest makes...
I know Sabrina's got a question, there are more questions, but we should allow our speaker to have a drink. He has earned it, don't you think? And there's no reason to hurry off. Anybody who wants a tour of the place, I'm happy to do it. And I'll bet that Pete would be willing to carry on this conversation with anybody who wants to listen.
After the first drink.
Yeah.